Our fourth presenter is George Enderle, who's the John T. Ryan Professor of International Business Ethics in the Mendoza College of Business here at Notre Dame. He's a former president of the International Society of Business Ethics, Economics, and he's been educated in Europe in multiple institutions in the areas of philosophy, theology, and economics and business ethics. He has extensive research and publication experience and teaching as well in Europe, the U.S., and China. Published over 120 articles and 18 books. His most recent book is Developing Business Ethics in China. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pat. I'm very pleased to be here and pleased about our conference. I think Ollie and Lee did a great job in putting together those different perspectives, and I think we can make a big step forward in supporting and in strengthening the UN Global Compact and the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. What I would like to do here is some reflections on the human rights, on the UN framework for business and human rights. And as Doug told us, John Ruggie, the special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations, started this project in 2005-06 and now came up with a framework which is quite smart, I think, well balanced, and gives us not only good ideas but also guidelines for implementing those human rights in corporations. Doug also said that we are early in the game, and I think that's absolutely true. I have been privileged to work on international business ethics now for almost 20 years. I joined Notre Dame in 1992, and I could focus on international business ethics. And in the 1990s, we had many interesting initiatives from, for instance, the Parliament of World Religions met in Chicago in 1993 to set up a global ethic for business and countries. And so many things happened, but at the turn of the millennium, the theme of business and human rights has been discussed with increasing urgency and in more circles. And Amnesty International and the Prince of Wales Business Leadership Forum published in 2000 important paper, Human Rights, Is It Any of Your Business? And so we know that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is quite old, since 1948, but what does that mean for business? Now, I would like to give first a few examples which you certainly know, just to give some concrete background illustration, talk about the basic assumptions of this framework, moral obligations of securing human rights, determining corporate responsibility for human rights, what does it really mean, and then also the question, to what extent does that maybe conflict with the self-interest of the corporation? Here are some cases, and they go through from 1995 to today. It is one shell-shocked and in the dock, that was 1995. I had a very interesting discussion yesterday evening with our friend Sir Mark Moody Stewart, who was, after that scandal in Nigeria, very instrumental in setting up 80 groups around the world within Shell to discuss the fundamental question, what is the responsibility of a global corporation today? And I think that was a very important learning experience, not only for Shell, but for the whole world. We had many other things, for instance, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation in Darfur, We had those environmental behavior of companies in Africa, CMPC, and what they do and what they don't do. But not only that, but those investment, the Franklin Templeton investment, JP Morgan Chase, Fidelity, Vanguard, are looking at those companies in terms of social and environmental responsibility. We have, of course, the Google case, which has quite famous, and the story is also very interesting if you follow that from January 2006, when Google announced the launch of Google CN, a self-censored version of the original site of google.com. In January, 4 years later, Google is no longer willing to censor results on its China site. In March 2010, about 1 year ago, all search requests on Google CN are now being redirected to Hong Kong arm and not censored any longer. And in July 1st, when everybody was expecting that the Chinese government would not renew the license of Google to operate in China, actually Google got that license. So it is an up and down and interesting development. But there are other cases about sweatshops, about labor relations, about access of all areas for access to medical care. Now, it was already mentioned the Center for John Ruggie and his Center for Business and Human Rights. This is, for me, the most important source of information about what's going on. And you can go there and you find the weekly updates. I checked on the 16th of March, so 1 week ago, what is there. For instance, a lead story about Japan nuclear crisis, reports on responsibility of TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, impacts on reactor safety, failures, etc. Enormous information, and not only that, but then also recent company responses and non-responses. What do they do with regard to the allegations, and how does the Center answer to that? Now, what are basic assumptions? Well, first, human rights are universally valid moral norms, which today have been recognized worldwide, although not undisputed, and we know that there are lots of discussions about whether or not it is a Western product, but I think the genesis of the Human Rights Declaration already shows that it is not just a Western product. Then human rights comprehend all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, including the rights to development. Third, human rights are minimal moral norms and do not encompass all relevant moral norms and values. That's an important point for many people who are very involved in human rights issues to think about that. And then the justification of human rights in Ruggie's framework, of course, are not justified or not addressed. There is a lot of discussion and it is highly complicated. But he takes that for granted. Now, what are those human rights? And Ruggie, in the report 2007, makes a list, and freedom of association, right to organize and participate in collective bargaining, the right to non-discrimination, abolition of slavery and forced labor, of child labor, right to work, right to equal pay for equal work, the right to equality at work, right to just and favorable remuneration, the right to safe work environment, the right to rest and leisure, and then the right to family life, other rights, the right to life, liberty, security of the person, freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, equal recognition and protection under the law, right to a fair trial, right to self-determination, freedom of movement, right of peaceful assembly, to marry and form a family, freedom of thought, conscience, religion, right to hold opinions, freedom of information, expression, right to political life, and right to privacy, and some more, the right to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, and housing, to physical and mental health, access to medical services, to education, to participate in cultural life, to a right to social securities. So you see 29 rights, and that's quite a lot. But the point the framework makes that all those rights are relevant for companies. And the question, of course, is, do we not expect from companies too much? Now, when we look at this, we can say that to state that all human rights must, as a minimal norm, be secured is completely is an important thing. But the basic issue then I think it's, well, who is responsible actually, and how to define the responsibilities. And I think Raghi does a good job in identifying those responsibilities more clearly. And we have to distinguish between the subject of obligations, the types of obligations, and then the criteria of assigning those obligations. And for that purpose, I suggest this framework. You see in the columns 3 types of respecting or securing human rights, namely to respect, to protect and remedy, and then promote as a more general category. This goes back to Henry Shue, a philosopher, political philosopher, who wrote a very important book on basic rights in the 1980s already, and he distinguishes those 3 types of honoring human rights. Respect means you have a company or a state has a direct impact on the violation of human rights and is involved directly or implicit or indirectly, and that's why to respect that is a first obligation. To protect is a different category, which means to protect anybody against the violation of human rights to third parties. And remedy, of course, means that companies or states have to address violations and to fix those problems. And in the rows we have different actors like the states, but also the transnational corporations, other organs and individuals. Criteria, there are a strict separation between the private and the public interest. That's very traditional, but Raghi, he says, well, the impact of the actor on the victims of violations is important. Then complicity of the actor, the sphere of influence is important, capability. Well, important, Raghi questions the sphere of influence criteria because he says this is too vague, and also the capability criteria is too vague. So the main question is, how can we understand or allocate those obligations to different actors? And the first criteria would look at the states, the second criteria, and the third at all those actors, but only with respect to direct impact on human rights and indirect. The third looks at sphere of influence of actors, and the fifth, capability of the actors. So, in other words, I come now to present Raghi's framework, which I think covers these areas which are illustrated in this matrix. And what is very interesting, I think, he has quite a good understanding of a balance between the states and transnational corporations in terms of respect, protect, and remedy. And in June this year, he will come out with the final guidelines how to implement those responsibilities. Let me come back to one point which he does not address at all, and I think that is the question about what is the corporation, and the corporation as a moral actor, but not a moral person. If you go back to the discussion in business ethics in the last 30 or so years, I think it has become pretty clear that companies are held or understood, recognized as moral actors, but not moral persons. And that's a relatively new development, but it's quite uncontroversial, at least among business ethicists. And it means that a collective entity acting with intention to achieve its goal and impacting on society and nature. And that's why it can be held responsible for its acts and impacts. And what does it mean a corporation is responsible? Here I refer to a famous German philosopher, Walter Schultz, who did a good, very serious study on the term and the understanding of responsibility. He says there are two, it's a bipolarity, inner part and the outer part. And inner part means self-commitment of an actor. I am responsible for the education of my children, but it is in worldly relationships, so in the world. And I think when we try to understand the UN framework, we can see those two dimensions, the inner and the outer external dimension, namely due diligence as it is required by Ruggie, and now it's, yeah. Okay. Required by Ruggie, and then concrete acts. Now, these responsibilities means, first, respect all human rights, due diligence a company has to do to examine on a regular basis their corporate strategies and activities with regard to all potential and actual impact on human rights, to make sure that all human rights are respected in that precise sense. Not just everything, but respected in terms of impact and complicity. And third, corporations are not responsible for all types of human rights violations, but only for respecting. And that's a very important thing. Now, the last question is about, does that conflict with the self-interest in a narrow sense? Very often, yes, with companies. But I think the enlightened self-interest of companies can include a long-term perspective and the benefits of all economic and other factors in the corporation. Due diligence is taken seriously by those companies, and the business case for human rights can be made in many cases, which is a very important thing. But my view is this is probably not enough, and the question is, of course, how to argue for that. Thank you very much.